The Viking Age didn't begin with a battle, it began with a betrayal. From legendary kings to lost settlements, this episode covers it all. They came from the mist, not as armies, not as kings, but as something else. Something the monks had no word for. The year was 793. And on a quiet island off the northeastern coast of England, a storm made of wood, iron, and fire descended on Lindisfarne. It was not just a raid. It was a moment when the world tilted. The sky stayed silent, but the sea remembered everything. This is the Viking Age. But who were they really? Were they savage pirates, godless killers who struck without warning and vanished before sunrise? Or were they skilled seafarers, merchants, and settlers, misunderstood by the very chroniclers who feared them most? What if we've inherited the wrong story? Over the next few hours, we'll follow the trail of these people, not just where they went, but who they became. From forgotten villages carved into the fjords of Norway, to silver markets humming in Abbasid Baghdad. From wind-blasted coasts in Greenland to the warmth of a firelit longhouse. And yes, from the blood-soaked stones of Lindisfarne to the iron gates of Constantinople. They were never just raiders. They were never just kings. They were a mirror to everything that came before and everything that followed. So take your time. Breathe. The ocean is wide. And the North is not done speaking. If this is your first time here, thank you for finding your way to this channel. It means a lot that you're curious enough to go back in time with me. There's a lot of noise online, but you chose to listen to history, and that says something about you. If you've been here before, welcome back. You already know how we do things around here. Slowly, carefully, with respect for the dead and fascination for the truth. This series is going to be long. It's going to be detailed. And it's going to be unlike anything else on YouTube. So if you haven't yet, subscribe. Not just because it helps the channel grow, but because I want you to be here for every hour of this journey. Comment your thoughts along the way. Challenge the story if you need to. History is conversation. It's never finished. Now let's keep going. The sea is calling. They weren't supposed to exist. Not like that. Not so fast. Not with such precision. But they did. And they came. No warning. No declaration of war. Just the sound of water and a shape in the mist. A hull longer than any local boat, carved like an animal, moving faster than the wind. The monks had no name for them. But the world soon would. We call it the Viking Age. But we start too late. Always too late. The truth is, no one expected the North to rise. If you stood in the great courts of Charlemagne in the late 700s, no one was talking about the people in the frozen margins. The Danes? The Geats? Irrelevant tribes from irrelevant lands. Too far to conquer. Too poor to matter. And yet, while the emperors were baptizing Saxons at sword point, while popes were drawing maps that left Scandinavia in blank gray, something was already stirring, in forests too dense for horses, in fjords too narrow for empire. In the dark, they were building something Europe didn't understand. Not armies, not castles, ships. But why? Why does a people with no gold, no empire, no standing army suddenly launch the most devastating maritime raids Europe has ever known? Historians will give you theories. That's their job. Some say population pressure, too many mouths, not enough fields. Others whisper about primogeniture, the law that gave land only to firstborn sons. What happens to the second son with ambition and no inheritance? He builds a boat. He gathers the angry. And he sails. There are whispers of climate shifts, subtle, invisible changes that made farming in the North more difficult. Hunger has always made men bold. But none of this explains the rage, the precision, the sudden knowledge of where the monasteries were, when their guards were weakest, and how to disappear before a single torch was lit. This wasn't random. And here's what no one tells you. The Vikings may have learned about Europe from the Saxons who fled Charlemagne's forced conversions. The refugees, the slaves, the mutilated. They brought more than their wounds, they brought maps. The Norse had no alphabet of their own, but they had runes and memory. And in the cold silence of the fjords, they remembered everything. Scandinavia is not a friendly land. It is not designed for comfort. The soil is thin. The winters are long. And the gods are never merciful. What little grows you hold close. What little dies you bury deep. In Norway, settlements rose like scars along the edges of mountains and sea. A man's world was often vertical, climbing for pasture, descending for fish. In Denmark, the land flattened, but the politics thickened. Power concentrated in hands that didn't always keep it well. In Sweden, the rivers ran east toward something vast. Toward silver. Toward cities no Latin monk had ever heard of. And here's the thing. They weren't isolated. Not even close. Archaeologists have uncovered Arabic dirhams, silver coins from Baghdad, buried in the ground of Swedish farms from the 9th century. These people knew how far the world stretched. They knew what it was worth, and they knew how to reach it. But they had a problem. The world had no reason to respect them, so they gave it one. Enter the longship. We think we understand this vessel. We don't. It wasn't a ship. It was a weaponized philosophy. Light enough to carry across land. Strong enough to cross oceans. Shallow enough to sail up rivers. Fast enough to vanish before your prayers could finish. The hull was built like ribs. The oars like teeth. The dragon head on the prow wasn't decoration. It was a message. I see you. I'm not afraid. And when that ship arrived at Lindisfarne, it brought more than steel. Lindisfarne. June 793. A holy island. Peaceful. Isolated. Home to monks who wrote, prayed, and believed the sea would protect them. They were wrong. The raiders tore through the monastery. They killed without hesitation. They dragged holy men into the sea and drowned them with the weight of their own faith. They took relics, gold, survivors, stories, and then, just like the tide, they withdrew. When word reached the rest of Europe, the shock wasn't just that it happened. It was how fast, how precise, and how brutal it had been. This wasn't a rebellion. It was an announcement. But here's the problem. Lindisfarne is not the beginning. It's the first thing we noticed. The Norse had been moving for decades. Some traded. Some settled. Some disappeared into local myths and emerged as saints, demons, or gods. The line between raider and merchant didn't exist. Not to them. One day a man sells furs. The next he sells the man who tanned them. Viking society was built on fluidity, of class, of power, of morality. The same ship that carries you to Mass on Sunday might burn a nunnery on Thursday. The same hand that cradles a child might swing a blade before breakfast. And so we ask again, what made a Viking a Viking? It wasn't the ship. It wasn't the axe. It was the decision to take what was not given. And never say sorry. The raids were only the beginning. What came next was settlement, kingdoms, and a rewriting of the European map that no one saw coming. They didn't sleep in mud huts. They didn't smell like beasts. And they didn't just raid. They built settlements so efficient, so organized, that modern archaeologists have mistaken them for Roman outposts. They carved timber not for beauty but to hold fire through the winter. And if you stood in a longhouse for even a minute, you'd understand something the sagas never set out right. This wasn't just about survival, it was about control. The longhouse didn't just protect a family. It defined one. Inside a Viking longhouse there was no such thing as privacy. Just hierarchy baked into the walls. The fire burned in the center, yes, but it didn't warm everyone equally. The head of the household sat near the flame. Slaves, thralls, slept closest to the door where the cold bit hardest. The walls were not always made of timber. In Iceland, entire homes were buried in earth, hidden like coffins under turf. Outside they looked like natural hills. Inside they smelled of sweat, smoke, fermented milk and blood. Tools hung from rafters. Spears leaned against bed frames. And the air, thick with soot, never cleared. Children breathed it in from birth. Their lungs remembered what their tongues forgot. Burials have revealed that some longhouses were booby-trapped, layered with hidden stones or animal remains, believed to ward off spirits or thieves. And some were left with the bodies of slaves still chained inside, too inconvenient to bury elsewhere. This wasn't home. It was a machine, and the gears were people. Forget the horned helmet. Look at the shovel. A Viking began his year not with a raid, but with a plow. In Norway, farmers carved terraces into the mountainside, pulling barley from cliffs with the same intensity others saved for battle. It wasn't romantic. It was war with the land. But when the crops failed, the ocean fed them. In the Lofoten Islands, they dried codfish on wooden racks so vast they resembled scaffolding for the gods. The smell stretched for miles. But it kept bellies full and made good trade. And trade, that was everything. You've heard about the Viking raids. But do you know about the Viking slave markets? In Dublin, founded by Norsemen, enslaved women from across the British Isles were bought and sold alongside amber and walrus tusk. In the east, Slavic captives were shipped downriver to Constantinople, then farther into the Islamic world, where Norse traders bartered them for silver minted in Baghdad. Some of these coins, marked in Kufic script, have been found in the graves of Viking women in Sweden. Women who wore necklaces made of Islamic silver, Roman glass, Baltic amber and broken Christian crosses. Not as decoration, as proof. We imagine them chewing on raw meat and meat. The truth? They were efficient and darkly inventive. They made blood sausage from animal intestines, mixed with oats and fat. In winter, meat was sometimes preserved by fermenting it underground, in pits lined with rotting leaves. The smell? Unbearable. The result? Life. But food wasn't just for sustenance. It was a weapon of class. In elite households, guests were served roasted duck, honeyed turnips, and smoked lamb, while thralls drank watery buttermilk and chewed boiled bones for the marrow. And if food was scarce, the rule was simple: the strong eat first. They didn't write recipes, but they passed down flavor, through muscle memory and mourning. A woman's cooking style could identify her clan. In some regions, marriage negotiations began with a bowl of stew. If the groom's family found it bland, the deal collapsed. Because taste wasn't just personal, it was political. They weren't filthy. They were obsessed with how they looked, and feared how others would talk. Every Norse grave yields combs. Combs carved from bone, from antler, from walrus ivory. Some decorated with serpent coils. Others with tiny curse runes, meant to prevent lice and gossip. Cleanliness wasn't just hygiene. It was reputation management. Men bleached their beards with lye. Women painted their eyelids with crushed minerals, not for beauty but to intimidate. Red ochre on the cheeks, charcoal under the eyes. Mirrors of polished bronze in the graves of those who valued their reflection enough to carry it into the next life. But here's what no one tells you. Jewelry wasn't just wealth. It was magic. Some rings were shaped like Thor's hammer. Others like snakes swallowing themselves. Ouroboros charms designed to protect the wearer from fate. Bronze amulets were buried inside clothing, stitched into linings hidden from view. Only a lover or a corpse would see them. Because appearance, like everything else in the Viking world, was layered. Nothing meant only one thing. You were never free. Even if you thought you were. Even if you could carry a sword, vote at the thing, own land or take a wife, You belong to someone. The gods. The land. Your jarl. Or fate itself. In the Viking world, freedom was a temporary illusion, and every illusion had a price. This was not a class system. It was a trap, passed from cradle to grave. At the top were the jarls, but they were not born in palaces. They were made through blood and fire. Some were sons of warriors. Others were sons of cowards who learned how to kill better. Their power came from networks of loyalty, gold, rumor, and terror. A jarl could decide a man's fate with a nod. His hall was lined with silver bracelets, but also the bones of rivals buried under the floorboards, because the Norse believed that killing a man and burying him beneath your threshold enslaved his spirit forever. His meat would rot, but his soul, it would guard the doorway for eternity. They weren't kings. Kings could be overthrown. Jarls were inherited myths. Beneath them, the carls, the so-called free men, toiled in mud, grain, and silence. They could trade. They could farm. They could own slaves. But if a storm wiped out their harvest or a son fell in debt, they could lose everything. Freedom was a rope, and most were already halfway hung. Some carls conspired. They poisoned their jarls slowly with herbs. Others paid berserkers to stage duels under false honor. Every feud, every alliance was drenched in threat. No man was safe. Not really. But pretending helped them sleep. At the bottom, the thralls. Slaves. Objects. Currency. Some were taken as children. Some were bought in bulk, branded like cattle. But the worst were the ones enslaved by their own people, sentenced by the thing or sold by desperate fathers. They slept in corners. Ate scraps. And were buried, sometimes alive, with their masters, mouths sewn shut to silence their screams in the next world. But not all thralls stayed silent. Some rose, quietly. Some fed their masters poison. Some raised their children in secret, teaching them vengeance and lullabies. The Norse knew this. That's why every household feared the silence more than the blade. If you broke the law or made a mistake, you didn't hire a lawyer. You walked into a clearing surrounded by men who might want you dead. This was the thing. A sacred place. But not safe. Your law was not read. It was spoken, from memory, by a law speaker trained since boyhood to carry hundreds of legal precedents in his head. There were no judges. Just peers. And enemies. Everyone carried weapons. Not for ceremony, for enforcement. The thing decided everything. Marriage disputes, land rights, murder prices. You could bribe. You could threaten. You could beg. But if the assembly turned against you, you were nothing. Some were fined. Others exiled. But a few were executed on the spot. Staked through the ribs. Hung by the tendons. Or buried beneath the stone they dared to speak against. The thing was the law and a reminder. Your life was never your own. The Vikings didn't just raid for silver. They raided for bodies. Slavery wasn't a shameful secret. It was a market strategy. In Dublin, Birka, Hedeby, Norse ports buzzed with the screams of the enslaved. Slavic girls. Irish monks. Anglo-Saxon children. Some slaves were bought with silver. Others were traded for salt, silk, or sex. There were levels of slavery. Some thralls could earn manumission. Others were sacrificed, drowned in bogs, stabbed in temple rites, or strangled and buried under the longhouse threshold to bind the luck of the home. Slave collars have been found etched with runes. If I run, I die. If I scream, I burn. The Norse saw this as normal, efficient. To question it was to challenge the gods. And even the gods were known to own slaves. Children were not children. They were investments, tools, and sometimes sacrifices. Newborns were tested, sometimes placed in cold water to see if they cried. If they didn't, they were considered weak and left in the woods to die. The Norse had no time for pity. only strength. Education was oral, yes, but not gentle. Children learned through blood. A boy learned to sharpen a blade before he could spell his name. A girl learned to command a household by age 10, and knew how to prepare poison from plants by 12. Fosterage was common. Elite children were given away to rival families, not as a gift but as political insurance. If one clan broke the peace, the foster child might be killed. These weren't hostages. They were bargaining chips with names. Girls were married off by 14. Boys were sent on raids by 15. And if a child died in battle, they were buried like adults, with swords, with jewelry, with pride. Because in the Viking world, you didn't grow up. You were thrown forward. They found the skull first. Split at the temple. Face down. Still biting dirt. The rest came later. Wooden floorboards blackened by fire, a brooch melted into bone, and a dog's skeleton curled around a child's shattered ribs. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a home. They had names once. Now they are known only as artifacts. Welcome to Hedeby. Once thought to be a minor trading outpost, Hedeby was a machine, churning in the shadows of Europe's kingdoms. Built where the land narrows and rivers bend, it became a gate between the Baltic and the North Sea. But gates don't open without risk. Gates bleed. At its height, Hedeby was a city of 2,000 people, more than London at the time. But there were no cathedrals here. There were warehouses filled with walrus ivory, slave shackles, and Byzantine glass. The quays were reinforced with animal bones. The roads paved with planks layered atop refuse pits, some filled with broken combs, some with fetuses in jars. Infanticide wasn't rare here. It was ritual. They found a man buried outside the city walls, head missing, spine twisted. No grave goods. No honor. And carved into a nearby beam, runes spelling the word Nyanger, traitor. Maybe he stole. Maybe he lost. Maybe he just spoke too loudly. But the most disturbing discovery? A pile of jawbones. Just the jaws. Human. Cut clean. Stored in a pit. Lined with salt. Then there's Jorvik, the city the English never meant to lose. When the great heathen army took York in 866, they didn't pillage. They administered. They minted coins. Drafted laws. Built roads. And they left behind a corpse that still stinks, not in blood but in intimacy. In 1976, beneath the streets of modern York, workers unearthed something impossible. Layers of Viking life frozen in filth. Everything preserved, leather shoes, lice combs, rotting fence posts, and a child's wool mitten, stitched tight, never worn down. The grave beside it was empty. But it's the cesspits that told the truth. Not the swords. Not the silver. They found tapeworms the size of ribbons, teeth ground to dust from chewing coarse bread, and remains of pigs, horses, and humans all burned together, possibly during an outbreak or famine. In one collapsed wall, they found a set of shackles still locked, with no body, meaning someone got free. Or someone took the corpse and left the warning. The silk thread in one child's tunic was traced to Central Asia, 4,000 kilometers away. That's not wealth. That's a message. Someone wanted that child to be remembered. But history forgot them anyway. The Jorvik Viking Center today is clean, family-friendly. There are wax figures and ambient sounds. You smell fake smoke and hear fake chatter. But what they don't tell you is this. Some of the real bodies, the ones that taught us what Vikings really were, are still missing, still unburied. And the ones we did find? Some had coins sewn under their tongues. Not for burial tradition, but to pay for silence in the next world. They say a Viking carried a sword like it was an heirloom. But that's only half the truth. The other half. Some of those swords, the ones etched with the sacred name Ulfbert, were not Viking made at all. They were forged with crucible steel, a material so pure, it wouldn't be replicated in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. Where did they come from? The answer isn't comforting. These blades likely passed through Baghdad, smuggled through Frankish hands, washed in silver and soaked in Eastern fire. When these swords cut, they didn't just kill. They whispered of empires the North had never seen. But those were rare. Most Viking weapons were more intimate, more cruel. The axe was not for the battlefield. It was for raids. It split door frames, skull plates. It hooked flesh. One blade, found near a burned Irish monastery, still had bits of human molar embedded in the iron. They weren't warriors. They were warnings. Spears? Ubiquitous. Cheap. Easy to make. But the Vikings didn't just throw them. They ritualized them. Before battles, warriors would thrust a spear over the enemy ranks and call out, "Odin owns you all." Why? Because in the Volsunga saga, Odin's spear marked who would die. They weren't killing. They were delivering. And the shield, their most misunderstood tool, wasn't just protection. It was bait. Viking shields were light, often covered in urine-soaked pig hide, meant to stink in battle. When they clashed together, they created a sound that echoed like drums of thunder, designed to terrify before blades even met. Worse still, shields weren't always round. Some had pointed, reinforced rims meant to punch through ribs when used defensively. The Viking ship was never a vehicle. It was a miracle machine of terror. Clinker-built with overlapping planks, these ships could twist with the waves, like beasts alive. They slid up rivers where no ship had business being. Some villages in Francia heard the sails before they heard the oars, square sails, dyed blood red to blend into dusk. And then they were ashore. 30, 60, 200 men. Faces painted. Shields screaming. Gone within an hour. And your church, your mother, your child, all memories now. Some Viking raiders didn't even land. They burned a beacon, made themselves seen, and let the panic drive lords to surrender treasure in exchange for mercy they had no intention of giving. In Ireland, one monastic chronicler wrote, "They moved like the sea had grown arms. But they weren't always visitors. Sometimes they wanted roots." The great heathen army wasn't a horde. It was a surgical invasion designed to fracture Anglo-Saxon England permanently. They didn't just kill kings. They absorbed dynasties. King Aella was captured. According to some traditions, they performed the blood eagle, a ritual in which the ribs were split from the spine and the lungs pulled out to resemble wings. Whether it happened or not, the myth alone dismantled resistance. People deserted before swords were drawn. The army's real tactic wasn't violence. It was occupation through entropy. They broke communications. They rewrote geography. They rebranded towns. They turned Christians into collaborators. Even Alfred the Great, the icon of resistance, paid them off. And the Danegeld only made them come back with more men. This wasn't pillage. This was colonization by erosion. As for armor, it rarely gleamed. Most Vikings couldn't afford iron mail. They wore felted wool, toughened leather, or nothing at all. But when they did wear helmets, some were designed not to protect, but to terrify. The Jormungbu helmet has a T-shaped eye cut, shaped like a skull, designed to unnerve enemies. And mail? The richest wore it. But it was hot, heavy, and vulnerable at joints. Some warriors died because they wore it. Others survived because they moved faster without it. There's one burial rarely discussed, found in Sweden. A warrior, skeleton intact. Mail shirt still clinging to his ribs. Inside the links, trapped fingers, not his own. No one knows if they were trying to rip it off or hold it shut. But someone went into the ground still holding on. They didn't fight for land. They fought to be remembered. And they knew memory requires blood. The Vikings weren't the most numerous army of their age. They were simply the most frightening, because they believed every scream echoed in the afterlife. Edington wasn't just a victory, it was a theological crisis. Alfred didn't just beat Guthrum, he baptized him, publicly, in front of the same people who'd seen Viking longships devour coastlines. Guthrum's surrender wasn't military, it was spiritual submission. The Christian God had seemingly won. But deep down the fear lingered, because in Norse myth even the gods die. And then came Malden, where English arrogance bled out. Earl Bertnoth let the Vikings cross a narrow causeway so they could fight honorably. But the Vikings knew better, honor was a trap. They butchered the Saxons. Bertnoth was hacked down mid-prayer, and his men stood over his body as it was defiled. Later one Viking wrote a poem about it, in Old Norse. It didn't gloat. It celebrated restraint. Because in their eyes they'd taught the English what real power looked like. But the final nail was Stamford Bridge, 1066. The Norwegians had taken their armor off in the sun. They were resting, laughing. King Harold's English forces marched day and night, arriving like shadows. Caught naked, the Norse formed ranks. One berserker held the bridge, slashing until an Englishman floated beneath it and stabbed him up through the groin. They say Harold Hardrada was shot through the throat. But his corpse wasn't buried for weeks. It swelled, split, and washed down into the ooze, bones lost to history. Ragnar Lothbrok is likely myth, but someone led those raids. Someone watched Paris burn. Someone laughed in a snake pit. And what matters more, whether he lived, or whether the English believed he would come back? Because Ragnar's sons believed the myth, and they avenged it like wolves raised on grief. Harald Hardrada, on the other hand, was real. He fought for gold in Constantinople, for power in Norway, and for legacy in England. He wrote his own saga, the Hrafismal, before he died. It ends not with victory, but with the gods turning their backs on him. He died in armor older than his enemies, a warrior out of time. And time killed him. Training wasn't a choice, it was expectation. A Viking boy who couldn't kill by 12 was a liability. They were taught to fish, fight, sail, and never flinch. Shame followed you longer than wounds. Cowards weren't buried, they were erased. Then there were the berserkers, real or exaggerated, doesn't matter. Their enemies believed. The berserkers wore wolf and bear pelts. Some carved runic curses into their skin before battle. Others bit into shields, drew blood from their own tongues, or smeared themselves in human fat, taken from sacrificial victims. Modern studies show they likely used henbane or fly agaric, mushroom toxins that caused delirium, vomiting, convulsions, and hallucinations. One recorded effect? The sensation of being eaten from the inside out, which they interpreted as Odin transforming them. A body found in Birka had filed teeth, a broken jaw, and the skull of a small animal stitched into his cloak. He was buried alone, upright. No one knows what he saw before he died. Every Viking war banner had a voice. The raven banner flapped only in battle. If it fell, so would the army. Carried by cedar witches, sometimes soaked in blood, sometimes embroidered with entrails, they weren't just flags. They were omens. Before a raid, Vikings often mocked local gods, burning icons, inverting crucifixes, or nailing pigs to altars. One raid left a child crucified to a church door, not out of strategy, out of symbolism. They believed their gods followed them. That Odin drank battle blood, and Freya counted the corpses. To spread fear, they'd sometimes burn only the churches, leaving everything else untouched. A message to the villagers: your god can't stop us. In at least 3 known cases, Viking warbands staged their own deaths, leaving shields behind and floating empty ships into harbors. When towns approached, they struck from the forest. Ghosts in flesh. The real terror of the Viking Age wasn't the raids. It was what happened when they stopped raiding. Because the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was planning. They didn't become kings. They became something worse, ghosts with maps. In the beginning, Viking warfare was simple. Find the weak spot, strike, and vanish. The raiders of Lindisfarne in 793 weren't testing a theory. They were proving a weakness. Monasteries, rich, isolated, pacifist, were soft targets. But this wasn't instinct. It was design. The Norse didn't attack at random. They brought men who knew how to read tides, how to track animal migrations, and how to predict human ones. Their raids were guided by natural science turned violent. They used sunstones to navigate through cloud cover, a form of early polarizing crystal, meaning they could strike during overcast weather when coastal defenses were lowered. That's not folklore. That's geochemical navigation before compasses. At first they left no routes behind. But that too was a tactic. Because rootlessness is its own kind of warfare, one that denies your enemy a clear place to attack. But the first phase collapsed under its own success. Villages began to fortify. Kings started to consolidate. And so the Vikings evolved, but not into knights or noblemen. They evolved into occupiers, saboteurs, and psychological colonizers. By the 9th century they stopped vanishing after the raid. They started to wait, and watch, and build. The great heathen army didn't conquer by outnumbering the English. It conquered by undermining alliances and reprogramming fear. They would fake retreats, lure Saxon forces across rivers, then collapse bridges behind them. Their camps used gravesite topography, placing longhouses directly atop buried enemy warriors. Not for disrespect, for dominion. A new home built on your dead father's chest. They learned to weaponize hostages, not just swords. In several cases they took Saxon heirs, raised them as Norse, and sent them back as governors. Not puppets. Converted sons. By the time English kings realized, their thrones had been hollowed out from the inside. But here's what no one tells you. They never abandoned raiding. They just rebranded it. Take the siege of Paris in 845. Yes, silver was paid. But lesser known is what happened after. Vikings left coded inscriptions on stolen relics, not in runes but in hybrid dialects that mocked both Latin and Old Norse. It was a linguistic scar, one that said, "We own your words now too." As they moved eastward, the Rus Vikings didn't stop at plunder. They married into Slavic royalty, and founded dynasties that eventually gave birth to the modern Russian state. But to secure those positions they learned Byzantine ceremonial warfare, including feigned allegiance, ritualized surrenders, and retribution as statecraft. They didn't change. They just got better at pretending they had. And in the north, Iceland, Greenland, Vinland, Viking tactics weren't militarized. They were existential. When Eric the Red led settlers to Greenland, he described it as lush and fertile. He lied. He knew it wasn't. But he understood something deeper than truth. You don't need paradise. You need belief. When you're outnumbered, outarmed, and out of land, you don't become a farmer. You become a myth. And myths are harder to kill than kings. By the 11th century, Viking tactics reached their final form. They stopped being warriors. They became memory engineers. Not the Great didn't take England by burning it. He took it by making its people think he belonged there. He issued coins with Christ's face, attended church, married local nobility, and quietly filled power roles with Norse loyalists. When he died, his empire collapsed. Because no one remembered how it was built, only that it felt inevitable. His sons didn't cry when he died. They measured the blood, counted the ribs, and swore revenge loud enough for the gods to hear. This wasn't a family. This was a myth wearing skin. And when it moved, kingdoms bled. There's a serpent in every Viking saga, and Ragnar's death was no exception. Legend says King Alla threw him into a pit of vipers. But Norse mythology revered snakes as death's reset switch, tied to Jormungandr, the world serpent destined to kill Thor at Ragnarok. So what if that scene wasn't about execution? What if it was ritual? Ragnar, if he existed, died not as a prisoner, but as a sacrifice. And his sons became the priesthood of that vengeance. Ivar the Boneless was no brute. In fact, his body may have betrayed him. Some believe he had a brittle bone disease, making his every movement painful, yet every victory more terrifying. The man who couldn't stand became the general who made entire regions kneel. He didn't fight wars. He dissolved systems. His most brutal act? Not for what he conquered, but for what he left untouched. He spared certain churches, allowed some Christian rulers to remain. To create doubt, to fracture the enemy from within by showing mercy unevenly. Ivar didn't just win. He edited belief systems. Bjorn Ironside, his brother, took things further, quite literally. He sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, entered the Mediterranean, faked his own death in Spain so his men could carry his coffin inside city gates. The coffin opened. Swords spilled out. No one records the name of the priest he killed first, but the city remembered the sound. Sigurd's snake in the eye, often overlooked, may have been the bridge between warlord and monarch, attempting to stabilize Norse identity in a world it had already burned. He understood something his brothers did not. If no one survives to write the saga, it ends in silence. Harald Bluetooth wasn't just a unifier. He was a language hacker. He created runestones, permanent propaganda, carved into earth and read by firelight. His biggest? The gelling stone. It declared him the man who Christianized Denmark. What it didn't mention. That conversion came after his defeat in battle, and was likely done to prevent Denmark's isolation from rising Christian empires. He was a Norse king who baptized out of strategic exhaustion. His reward? His own son rebelled. Sweyn Forkbeard betrayed Harald, exiled him, and then did something no Viking had done before. He returned not to raid England but to wear its crown. His power came not from terror, but from predictable violence. The English paid tribute, Danegeld, and Sweyn learned how to tax fear. When he died, England groaned under the weight of its mistake, because now it belonged to his son. Canute the Great ruled over a North Sea empire, Denmark, Norway, England, and he did so by weaponizing restraint. His most famous moment wasn't on a battlefield. It was on a beach. Courtiers flattered him, saying he could command the tides. So Canute sat at the shoreline, told the tide to retreat, and watched the water rise. It wasn't arrogance. It was public humiliation theater. His way of proving only God holds that power, not kings. What modern historians forget is the political genius of that act. Canute was telling the church, I'm yours. But to the people he was saying, I choose this crown. I don't need it. He wasn't just king. He was the curator of perception. Alfred was not meant to rule. He was the fifth son, the overlooked one. Raised on prayers and poems, not blades. But fate cleared a path in blood. Brother after brother died. And when the great heathen army landed, Alfred had to become something he wasn't ready to be. A shadow king. He didn't meet Ivar head-on. He hid. Fled into the marshes. Starved. There, according to legend, he burned bread offered by a poor woman. A moment held up as humility, but maybe it was the first sign of detachment. He was a king disguised as a peasant who learned how to disappear. Then came Eddington. Alfred didn't win by might. He won by fatigue, by dragging out resistance long enough to fracture Viking alliances. He baptized Guthrum, the Viking leader, but made sure it was public, humiliating, and recorded. He didn't want conversion. He wanted surrender of identity. After victory, Alfred built fortified towns stocked with supplies and guards, each placed no more than 20 miles from each other, the distance a man could walk in a day. He created a neural network of defense before computers ever existed. But what most don't know, Alfred sacrificed whole regions to the Danes to buy time. He abandoned parts of Mercia. He let monasteries burn, not because he didn't care, but because he needed the fire to draw the enemy away. These weren't just men. They were weapons sharpened by myth, betrayal, and necessity. And every crown they wore sat atop a grave. The Danelaw wasn't a surrender. It was a virus, coded in law disguised as peace. And the English never recovered. Imagine a kingdom where invaders wrote the rules and the natives thanked them for it. After the initial carnage of the great heathen army, the Vikings didn't vanish. They planted roots. Not out of goodwill, but necessity. They couldn't hold England by the sword forever. So they used ink instead of iron. The Danelaw wasn't just a border. It was a legal firewall. Within it, Viking settlers enforced Scandinavian law over English soil. But here's the sinister twist. Instead of erasing local customs, they rebranded them. Orgild? Already Anglo-Saxon. The Thing? Not unlike early English moots. This was legal mimicry, not legal harmony. The Vikings crafted a system so familiar that resistance looked like betrayal of one's own culture. And it worked. The Norse weren't converting. They were converting others to the illusion of integration. They held assemblies in Norse, judged crimes with Norse customs, and buried gods beneath new cathedrals. They didn't just conquer land, they made their enemies complicit in forgetting who ruled it first. Worse still, English kings later preserved the Danelaw in their own law codes. What started as occupation ended as foundation. Dublin. Today it's a literary capital. In the Viking Age it was the largest slave hub in the British Isles. This wasn't incidental. It was strategic. Irish politics were fractured, clans at war, kingship elective, power ephemeral. The Vikings didn't need to conquer. They just offered stability through brutality. They sold Irish women, monks, even rival Vikings into slavery. Sometimes for silver. Sometimes for alliances. Sometimes just to erase a bloodline. And yet, these same slavers married Irish princesses, adopted Gaelic names, built stone churches. By the time of Olaf Quarren, it was impossible to say where the Norse ended and the Irish began. He ruled Dublin and York, not as a foreign invader but as a bilingual, by-faith monarch. He wasn't unique. He was the template. In Scotland, Norse Earls of Orkney and the Isles ruled entire seas, often with more authority than Scottish kings. They didn't conquer with armies. They controlled coasts, fisheries, and shipping routes. The Highland clans? They paid tribute to Norse warlords wearing Christian crosses, the same men who, by night, whispered Odin's name. Here's what's terrifying. The further north you go, the less the church mattered. In the Hebrides, the line between bishop and berserker was paper thin. Rollo didn't kneel to get Normandy. He refused to kiss the king's foot, and the Frankish court had to drag a warrior into submission by proxy. It wasn't a conversion. It was a performance, a mockery, and it bought the Vikings everything. Normandy became a Frankenstein state, Norse by blood, Frankish by law, Christian by convenience. And in this hybrid shell, something terrifying incubated. The Normans didn't forget their lineage. They weaponized it. Rollo's descendants learned the rules of Latin Christendom, only to use them as legal siege engines. They married into French nobility. They bribed bishops. They hired chroniclers to rewrite their pagan past as divine destiny. And in 1066, William the Bastard, a direct descendant of Rollo, crossed the English Channel not as a Viking, but as a papally sanctioned, state-certified heir to the English throne. That's the twist. The most famous English conquest in history was a Viking revenge plot, carried out by a man whose blood came from the north, and whose tactics came from Rome. The Vikings didn't just conquer land. They hijacked identity. And centuries later we still call their empires by the names they taught us to use. What if the Vikings never vanished? What if they just changed flags, and forgot their names? Because somewhere between the sword and the cross, between Odin and Christ, they made a trade they couldn't undo. They gave up their language for a throne. It didn't begin with a coronation. It began with a contract. In the 9th century, Slavic tribes invited a Norse warband to rule them. At least that's what the primary chronicle claims. But what if the truth is darker? What if Rurik wasn't invited? What if this was the first hostile corporate takeover in European history? Rurik's dynasty didn't integrate. It subdued. Within a generation, Viking elites dominated key trade routes: Novgorod, Smolensk, and finally Kiev. But here's what they did differently. They didn't just plunder. They standardized. Their rule wasn't a temporary outpost. It was a permanent administration, modeled not on Viking raiding customs but on Byzantine imperial bureaucracy. They collected tribute, issued written laws, built stone churches. But they still hired themselves out as mercenaries in Constantinople. The Rus were bodyguards by contract and kings by accident. And here's the gut punch. The Rurikids, founders of Kievan Rus, would rule for 700 years, long after they forgot the sound of Norse. They didn't just vanish. They translated themselves into history's bloodstream. Russia's double-headed eagle? It's just a long ship folded into a throne. In Scandinavia, kingship didn't emerge. It was forced, dragged screaming from the Thingstone to the altar. Harald Bluetooth baptized his people, not with persuasion but with pressure. His conversion was strategic compliance, a declaration to Europe: we are one of you now, so don't invade us. But the gods didn't die quietly. His own son, Sweyn Forkbeard, rebelled. This wasn't just a family quarrel. It was a war between pagan legacy and Christian legitimacy. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason enforced Christianity by sword point. He burned temples, executed priests. He wasn't spreading faith. He was committing spiritual arson. Still, the old gods lingered in valleys and fjords, whispered in sagas. And here's what no one admits. Olaf himself was deeply superstitious. According to later tales, he had prophetic dreams, wore talismans, and believed in omens until the day he died. In Sweden, kingship came late. Too late to matter peacefully. Uppsala's sacred grove was filled with horses, humans, and blood trees, a pagan resistance hidden beneath the facade of royal legitimacy. Christian kings ruled from stone, but the peasants still buried their dead with Thor's hammer necklaces well into the 1100s. These weren't clean transitions. They were violent rewrites of memory. A culture doesn't die in war. It dies in silence, when its children stop naming their gods aloud. This is what no king dares admit. To become legitimate, they had to bury their ancestors. And to wear the crown, they had to forget the sound of their own mother tongue. Are you ready for the final betrayal? Because the worst part of the Viking Age wasn't when it ended. It's that it ended by choice. They never needed to conquer the world. They just needed the world to stay distracted. While kings argued over titles and priests debated doctrine, a quiet swarm moved like a shadow through the water. The Vikings didn't invent terror, they turned it into infrastructure. And what came after them wasn't peace. It was Europe redrawn by predators. The British Isles in the 8th and 9th centuries were not unified lands. They were wounded animals walking in circles, bleeding kingdoms like Northumbria, Wessex, and Dalriada. Lindisfarne wasn't just a raid. It was a recon mission, and the monks, too terrified to fight back, became the first witnesses of the new warfare. The Norse came not to occupy cities but to break time itself, to create such unpredictability that nothing sacred remained. And then they stayed. In Ireland, Dublin wasn't a Viking city. It was a slave factory. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, Dublin trafficked in human lives at a scale that dwarfed even later medieval markets. Slavic girls, Irish boys, Scottish nobles, bought, sold, loaded onto ships, and vanished into history. The Irish kings allowed it when it suited them. Some even married Norse blood. Genocide wrapped in alliances. Scotland gave up its coasts, one stone at a time. The Northern Isles became Norse colonies, and Viking earls extracted tribute like emperors. The bloodlines that rule Orkney today? Many trace back to colonial rape, not diplomacy. Wales was a resistance poem, but it bled. Rhodri Mar, yes, fought back. But even he could not stop the fact that Welsh churches were burned, their monks mutilated, their relics taken as trophies, not loot. This wasn't just raiding. This was terraforming. In 845, Paris didn't fall. It begged. When Ragnar's fleet, whether myth or man, slid up the Seine, the city had time to prepare. But it didn't. Why? Because they didn't believe the Northmen would dare. The psychological rot had already set in. The Franks, used to their own barbarian myths, couldn't imagine someone else would write new ones. 7,000 pounds of silver later, they left. But not before executing prisoners as theater, hanging them on bridges to remind the locals, "We are not your enemies. We are your new weather." Frankish kings responded not with armies, but with paper. Capitularies, regional defense plans, church processions. But the Vikings came again, and again. Smaller fleets, targeted raids, psychological warfare. They targeted saints' bones because they understood the currency of fear, iconoclasm. The church too gave in. Monasteries paid tithes to keep from being burned. In effect, Christ was ransomed city by city. They say Rollo converted. That he accepted baptism, land, and a Frankish title in exchange for peace. But what they don't say is that his men laughed as the king was humiliated, forced to give land to the very wolves who had burned it. Normandy was a puppet show with the strings reversed. The Franks thought they were civilizing the Norse. Instead, they were funding their next invasion. Rollo installed Norse legal traditions, language, and a warrior elite. His son married into Frankish nobility. His grandson? William the Conqueror. What was Normandy? It was a malware injection into European monarchy. By 1066, it would replace English royalty with descendants of Norsemen. And the language of the court would shift forever, because one king made a deal with the devil and called it peace. You think the Viking Age ended? Look at your laws, your borders, the names of your kings. It didn't end. It rebranded. You were told they only went west. But that's a lie. While your schoolbooks pointed to Lindisfarne, and Hollywood gave you horned helmets, the Vikings had already mapped the underbelly of the known world. They weren't just raiders. They were traders, warlords, diplomats, and spies. And sometimes they were something worse, ghosts in another empire's bloodstream. They called themselves the Rus. But the Caliphs, Byzantines, and Slavs had a different name for them, the invisible men, those who appeared from the north with silver, with slaves, with silence. The Vikings didn't just reach Constantinople. They reached Baghdad. They navigated the Volga and Dnieper like veins, not rivers. And they brought with them not just goods, but an entirely new way of dissolving boundaries. How many knew that Swedish warriors served in Islamic armies? That Norsemen converted to Islam not out of belief but trade leverage? That Viking chieftains minted Arabic coins with Allah's name on one side, and were buried with Thor's hammer on the other? This wasn't contradiction. It was power. Even more unsettling, the Norse didn't force their gods on others. They absorbed. They wore Byzantine silk under wolfskin cloaks. They drank from Christian goblets in pagan ceremonies. They learned your language, your laws. Then they sold your children back to you, for silver. Eric the Red wasn't a hero. He was a killer who turned exile into empire. He lied when he named Greenland, a marketing trick to lure settlers into the ice. But Greenland didn't die from weather alone. It died from ecological arrogance. They brought over Norwegian farming methods unsuited to the Arctic. They overgrazed, deforested, and ignored Inuit knowledge systems. And when the climate turned colder, a little ice age began, they chose to starve with pride rather than adopt foreign ways. Evidence now suggests they ate their dogs, then their horses, then maybe each other. Their last churches show signs of rapid abandonment. Some were found with valuables still buried beneath the altar, as if praying for rescue that never came. And no one returned to look for them, because failure was erased, not remembered. The Norse found America 500 years before Columbus. They landed on Newfoundland's shores, built houses, and named the place Vinland. But they didn't call it that for grapes. They called it that to sell it, just like Greenland. The Sagas describe Leif Erikson's journey with strange specificity. Fertile land, rivers teeming with salmon, rich forests, but also violence, fear. People who didn't run. They met the Skraelings, now believed to be ancestors of the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq, and tried to trade. But the Norse brought arrogance, and the land spat them out. It wasn't disease. It wasn't climate. It was resistance. Had they stayed, European contact with the Americas might have begun centuries earlier. But it didn't, because the New World saw what they were, and fought back. This isn't just alternate history. This is a missed colonization. A moment where another empire could have risen, and didn't. So here's the truth. The Viking Age didn't end because they ran out of ocean. It ended because they tried to swallow the world. And the world finally bit back. And yet, their fingerprints are still on your maps, your money, your myths. They went everywhere. And no one stopped them in time. They told their children, if you see sails with dragon heads, run. Not because they were Vikings. Because by the time the dragons appeared, it was already too late. In 859 AD the sea caught fire. Not metaphorically, literally. The longships that tore through the Strait of Gibraltar burned coastal towns, enslaved entire villages, and vanished before the screams reached the next city. This wasn't exploration. It was surgical violence, refined over centuries, unleashed on civilizations that thought themselves safe under the Mediterranean sun. Most people imagine the Vikings in mist and pine. But in the heat of Andalusia, the Norse appeared like ghosts from a dead age. They raided Seville, under Muslim control, in an attack so sudden and brutal that Arab chroniclers described it as divine punishment. They burned the main mosque, slaughtered worshippers, and cut the ears off survivors to mark them as cowards. And they didn't stop. They sailed east, striking the Balearic Islands, harassing the coasts of Provence, and eventually launching a surprise attack on Pisa. Yes, they reached Italy. But here's what almost no one discusses. They weren't just looters. They were data collectors. They studied defenses, they timed tides to ambush markets, and they left survivors alive on purpose. Not out of mercy, but so stories would spread. They understood psychological warfare long before it had a name. Even in North Africa they left traces. Islamic sources describe attacks along the Moroccan coast by tall, pale warriors who drank from bowls of human skin. Some thought they were cursed Berbers. Others believed they were jinn, fire spirits who walked on water. The Vikings didn't crave gold. They wanted silver, not for decoration but for power. And the Islamic world, especially the Abbasid Caliphate, was silver's fountainhead. They sailed up the Volga and Dnieper, trading furs, walrus ivory, and slaves for dirhams, Arabic coins inscribed with verses from the Quran. Some of these coins ended up buried deep in Swedish soil, sometimes hundreds in a single hoard, clipped and weighed obsessively. But here's what they don't teach in textbooks. The Vikings sold Christian captives, monks, children, women, to Muslim buyers in exchange for this silver. They raided holy sites in the west, then sold the faithful to the east. Your ancestors, if you're from Northern Europe, might have died in a prayer circle and been sold in a slave market in Baghdad. And the dirhams? They were buried, not for safety, but as offerings, to the dead, to the gods, to something darker. Researchers now believe that many of these hoards were ritualistic, not economic. Some were buried beneath homes, others beside graves. One was found arranged in the shape of a serpent, as if the Vikings feared what the silver represented, or feared what would happen if they ever spent it. In 2014, archaeologists found a 10th century map etched into birch bark in northern Russia. It depicted trade routes between Viking outposts and Muslim cities, routes never recorded in Christian texts, spanning from Novgorod to Nishapur. Why is that terrifying? Because it proves the Vikings didn't just explore the Mediterranean. They may have been tracking, mapping, and controlling parts of it. And if that's true, then our entire understanding of early global trade, Islamic Christian dynamics, and European exploration timelines is shattered. They weren't just monsters. They were mirrors, reflecting the worst of every culture they touched, and leaving behind a silver trail of silence. Are you ready to follow them to the last place anyone expected them to appear? Because next, they enter the gates of Constantinople. And the emperor doesn't fight them. He hires them. They didn't believe gods created the world. They believed gods murdered it into existence. The body of a frost giant, Ymir, split open like a sacrificial animal. His flesh became land. His bones became mountains. His skull became the sky. His blood, every ocean you've ever sailed. This is the world the Vikings inherited. Not born in love. Born in dismemberment. The Vikings believed in a tree, but not the kind you climb. Yggdrasil was so vast that it bled. Its roots stretched into realms of death, its branches touched the hall of the gods, and in between were men, screaming for meaning. 9 worlds, not symbolic, not metaphysical, actual, tactile places held in fragile cosmic tension. The gods walked one, the giants stalked another, and in one hidden beneath the soil, hell ruled over those who died without honor. The ones who died sick, or quietly. But even the gods were temporary, because this wasn't a religion of peace. It was a prophecy of total collapse. Ragnarok wasn't a metaphor. It was fate. Odin would be torn apart by his own creation. Thor would die vomiting poison. The world would be burned by fire giants. And in the ashes, a boy and girl hiding in the tree would survive. That's what made Viking religion so dangerous. It didn't promise victory. It promised ruin and survival despite it. Odin was the god of kings and liars. He kept no oaths, disguised himself as beggars, and traded his eye for forbidden knowledge. He didn't want worship. He wanted sacrifice. At Uppsala they gave him exactly that. 9 humans, 9 horses, 9 days, hung from trees. Their blood soaked the roots, offerings to keep the world from falling apart. Thor, the protector? He crushed skulls with a hammer. But that same hammer was also used in wedding ceremonies, placed on a bride's lap to sanctify the union. Love and death bound by steel. Freya, goddess of fertility, war and seer, a terrifying magic feared even by gods. She rode into battle in a chariot pulled by cats, wept tears of gold and taught Odin magic. Her worship often involved sexual rites, animal entrails and chanting until trance. Loki? Chaos-given skin. He birthed monsters. He caused the death of Balder, the shining god of light. And he will lead the armies that destroy the world. Yet he dined with the gods, every night. And then there were the forgotten ones. Hel, Odin's granddaughter, half-rotted and cold-eyed, who ruled over the dead not brave enough to die with a sword in hand. Iskathi, a goddess who chose her husband by his feet. Surt, the fire demon waiting beneath the earth, destined to burn everything. This was not a tidy theology. It was chaotic, violent, incestuous, and eerily logical, because it mirrored the real world. Viking worship wasn't humble. It was transactional. They didn't pray. They bargained. They gave blood for luck. They buried horses under homes to keep out spirits. They broke the legs of slaves before entombing them alive with their masters. They sacrificed animals at seasonal blots, but also humans. One woman was found beheaded, ritually dismembered, and sown with wildflowers. No one knows her name, but her death was precise, too precise for rage. It was for a god. And don't forget the Volar, priestesses so feared that warriors refused to make eye contact. They carried staffs carved with symbols no one dared speak aloud. Some may have worn clothes made from foreskin, pelts soaked in blood, or necklaces of bones. To speak prophecy they inhaled herbs, fasted, chanted, and screamed. Some died mid-vision. Others were buried sitting up, facing the sea. Every rune was a prayer and a curse. Every grave was an altar. And the Norse feared witchcraft more than battle, because a sword only ends a life. But a spell could erase your name from time itself. This wasn't a belief system. It was a mirror, showing them how to live, how to die, and how to never be forgotten. But when Christianity came, it didn't just ban the gods. It hunted the women who remembered their names. And that's where we go next. The purge of the old world, one bonfire at a time. What do you bury when you want something to stay dead? A sword? A wife? A god? For the Vikings the answer was often, all three. They didn't build churches. They built memories in wood and bone. Temples that stank of blood and echoed with the silence of things too holy to name. The temple at Gamla Uppsala wasn't just a shrine. It was a nexus of power, where religion, kingship, and ancestral terror merged. Its golden roof shone for miles, but it was what lay behind it that mattered. A grove where men were hanged, horses disemboweled, and slaves strangled as part of the great 9-year blot. Not once. Not in legend. Every 9th year. A horror on schedule. But here's the truth most never hear. The kings who ruled Uppsala were seen as divine. Refusing to sacrifice might bring famine. In some cases, the king himself could be sacrificed if the crops failed. Religious centers like Uppsala were not passive places of worship. They were machines, feeding fate with blood and fear. And not all temples were grand. Some were simple stone circles, waterfalls, or bogs where offerings were made in silence. In Denmark, one site shows over 400 animal skeletons, not butchered but ritually killed and arranged. The gods weren't in heaven. They were in the land. And they were always hungry. You've heard the myths. But myths don't rot. Bones do. In Trelleborg, the remains of men and boys were found with broken legs, not in battle but likely post-mortem. Their wounds didn't bleed. Their deaths weren't chaotic. They were designed. In Hofstare, hundreds of sheep skulls faced east, their tongues removed, their deaths eerily uniform. Ritual? Yes. But why were the tongues taken? And the Oseberg ship, famous for its grandeur, hides a secret in plain sight. The younger of the two women may have been killed, not honored. Her ribs were crushed inward, her skull intact. No signs of age, disease, or battle. And then there's the most disturbing discovery. Horse skulls buried beneath doorways. To step into your home was to walk over a sacrificed beast, laid there to guard or curse. We don't just find blood. We find messages in flesh. Sacrifice wasn't only about pleasing gods. It was about manipulating reality, altering outcomes, punishing enemies, or binding spirits. And sometimes, to bury someone was to say, "Don't come back." If you think a Viking burial was about peace, you've misunderstood everything. Burials weren't closure. They were contracts. A good death meant a ship, grave goods, a feast. But many weren't good. Some were silenced with violence. The swords were bent before burial, not as tribute but to prevent their return. And men were buried face down, a curse to keep their eyes from watching the living. In Sweden, one grave had a woman buried atop another, the lower woman's hands bound. Some believe she was a seeress, sacrificed to serve in the afterlife. Others think she was the murderer, pinned in death to the one she betrayed. And then, runestones. They weren't just grave markers. They were public declarations of memory, revenge, or warnings. Some invoke Thor's protection. Others threaten anyone who disturbs the dead with eternal torment in hell's domain. The Vikings feared not being remembered, but they also feared being remembered incorrectly. Which is why some stones lie blank, the names chipped off, deliberately erased. Even in death, politics mattered. And vengeance had no expiration date. These people didn't fear death. They feared being unworthy of death. And when their gods fell silent, when the crosses rose and the groves went dark, the old magic didn't disappear. It went underground, into stories, into bones, and sometimes into dreams. Next we follow the missionaries, and the blood they found waiting for them. The gods didn't fall. They were pushed, but some climbed back up through the pages, wearing new names. The Christianization of the Viking world didn't start with a sword. It ended with a vote. In Iceland year 1000, the chieftains met at the Althing. Civil war loomed, half the island Christian, half loyal to Thor and Odin. One man, Orger the law speaker, went to ground, alone. For 24 hours he lay beneath a fur cloak, unmoving. When he rose, he declared Iceland Christian, but with compromises. Pagan sacrifices could continue in secret and old laws would remain so long as they bent toward the church. This moment is critical. It wasn't just about belief. It was about maintaining unity, avoiding bloodshed. Christianity didn't arrive through overwhelming faith. It arrived through realpolitik. Elsewhere, like Norway and Denmark, the conversion was bloodier. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason destroyed temples and executed sorcerers. Resistance came in whispers, and in the form of Thor's hammer pendants that doubled as crosses, allowing wearers to hide both faiths at once. The hybrid age had begun, neither pagan nor Christian, but something quietly defiant in between. Most people think of the sagas as stories. They're wrong. They were weapons of memory, forged long after the age of raiders ended. The Prose Edda, for example, claims that Odin wasn't a god at all, but a Trojan king who migrated north and tricked people into worshipping him. This wasn't ignorance. It was strategic literary masking. Snorri Sturluson, a Christian himself, knew what he was doing. By framing Odin as mortal, he protected the transmission of pre-Christian cosmology in a Christian world. It was an intellectual loophole, allowing scholars and monks to study the gods without being accused of heresy. But here's what few mention. Some sagas don't just tell stories. They hide mathematical calendrical knowledge, astronomical cycles, and ancestral lineages. They're databases, not just narratives. And they're incomplete. Entire families of sagas were never written down, or were destroyed by later Christian authorities. What we have now is a curated set, shaped by 13th century biases. How many tales were too pagan to survive? We don't know. But scholars suspect hundreds were lost. A skald wasn't just a poet. He was a neural network in human form. The poetry form called drakvate was not just difficult. It was artificially complex, designed to create neurological hooks. Internal rhymes, alliteration, syllable count, all used to force the brain into retention. Before writing, this is how kings were remembered. A skald's loyalty wasn't measured in gold, but in immortality. If he spoke your name in verse, you outlived death. And some skalds became dangerous. One, named Eyvindr Skaldespiller, was accused of using poetry to summon storms. Whether or not that's true, what matters is the fear that words alone could change fate. Even under Christianity, skalds persisted. But the content changed. Odin was renamed. Thor's hammer vanished. Still, in the corners of the verse, in the kennings and metaphors, the old gods hid in plain sight. And in rural Iceland, elderly women would chant fragments of skaldic verse to sheep in birthing season, believing the old rhythms carried fertility magic. Christian or not, they never stopped singing. The last Viking didn't die in battle. He died in a monastery, copying the very myths his ancestors once bled to preserve. Legal rights of Viking women, property, divorce, dowries. Viking women were not simply caretakers or passive participants in the sagas of their male counterparts. Legal rights granted them a substantial degree of independence in a world otherwise dominated by war and conquest. Yet, this legal power did not translate into complete freedom. It was circumscribed by the patriarchal structures of Viking society. Women could own property, and many had control over their dowries, which often consisted of land, livestock, and even slaves, assets that could be used to negotiate power within their families and communities. This legal autonomy was unique compared to other medieval societies, where women's rights were often limited by a system of male guardianship. Divorce was another area where Viking women stood out. If a marriage became untenable, Viking women had the legal right to initiate divorce, keeping their dowry and retaining the children. These legal rights were not just symbolic. They gave women a certain degree of control over their own lives in a society where blood feuds and shifting power dynamics often determined one's fate. However, it was not all autonomy. Women in Viking society were expected to uphold family honor and, like their male counterparts, had obligations to their families and the community's stability. When examined through the lens of social structure, Viking women's rights were more about managing the home and the estate rather than ruling in the same way men did. But make no mistake, this was significant power in a world where property and land ownership defined one's status. Women in Viking society were not passive bystanders. They were the economic backbone of their communities. While men may have sailed off on raids or expeditions, it was the women who maintained the day-to-day functioning of the farm, managed trade in bustling Viking markets, and took charge when men were away. Farm management was a woman's domain. She was responsible for growing crops, raising livestock, and ensuring the family's economic survival. Women often maintained control of household wealth. Tools, textiles, and grain were regularly transferred to the women's care. And let's not overlook trading. Viking women were active participants in the exchange of goods, both within the Nordic world and beyond. From silk and silver to amber and textiles, women played an integral role in these exchanges, overseeing transactions that spanned the Baltic, the British Isles, and the Middle East. Archaeological evidence points to the active trade routes Viking women traveled along, both as traders and custodians of household wealth. Some women, particularly in Iceland and Greenland, took part in the transatlantic trade routes with Native American groups, creating early cross-cultural exchanges in the New World. Such involvement challenges the often-cited notion that Viking women were confined to domestic life. The concept of the shield maiden, a woman who fought alongside men in battle, has become a central figure in modern interpretations of Viking history, yet its historical accuracy is often questioned. Were Viking women truly warriors, or is this a myth? The answer, surprisingly, may lie somewhere in between. Archaeological discoveries, including the famous Jerringhage grave, have revealed Viking women buried with weapons like swords, shields, and arrows, suggesting that they may have participated in combat, but the prevalence of this role is uncertain. The shield maiden debate hinges on our understanding of Viking society's militaristic nature. Viking culture valued bravery and honor, and women, just as men, were expected to uphold these values in the face of battle and death. Yet, warfare for women was not necessarily about taking part in large-scale combat. Many Viking women were likely involved in logistical support during raids, from tending to the wounded to managing supply lines. While rare, those who did take up arms were often of noble birth, empowered by their family status and resources. These were not just warriors but symbolic figures, representing the ideal of the Viking woman, fierce, independent, and resolute. In the stories, they were the fierce women who stood side by side with men, wielding swords, engaging in battle. But how much of this is myth and how much is true? The legacy of the shield maiden is still debated today. Was she an idealized hero, a warrior born out of necessity in a time of chaos, or did she truly embody the martial spirit of the Viking Age? The truth lies somewhere between myth and history, where women's roles were often defined by circumstance, culture, and necessity. What remains unclear is how many women fought in the Viking Age's blood-soaked raids, and how many wielded more power in their homes than in battle. Was the shield maiden the exception or the rule? In the heart of Sweden, a discovery would shatter long-held perceptions of Viking women. In 2017, the Birka grave, one of the richest Viking burial sites found, yielded the body of a warrior, initially presumed to be male. The burial, which contained a sword, shield, and horse equipment, suggested a high-ranking Viking fighter. But after DNA analysis, it was revealed that this warrior was, in fact, a woman, an extraordinary revelation that rewrote history. This discovery is far from isolated. Across Scandinavia, women's graves from the Viking Age often contained elaborate items that reflected wealth, status, and even leadership roles. In Iceland, for instance, women's graves featured fine textiles, silver, and jewelry, items that signified a complex and empowered economic role in Viking society. Viking women, particularly those of higher social status, were often active participants in the economic life of their communities, whether managing trade, land, or commerce. But the Birka grave's revelation also calls into question our understanding of women's role in Viking society. Were shield maidens like the one found in Birka an isolated anomaly, or did Viking women, whether as warriors or leaders, play a more central role than we have ever imagined? While most Viking women's lives remain veiled in mystery, the sagas offer a tantalizing glimpse into their experiences. Rune stones, scattered across Scandinavia, memorialize the achievements of both men and women, though the latter's stories are often underreported. Yet, upon closer examination, we find that women's names etched in these stones tell a different story than previously believed. Lagertha, Freydis, and Aslog appear in sagas as fierce women of both leadership and strength, not just passive figures. The name Freydis Eriksdottir, for instance, emerges not only in stories but as a historical figure who journeyed to the farthest reaches of the known world, aiding her brother Leif Erikson in the establishment of Vinland, modern-day Newfoundland. This was no ordinary feat for a woman of her time. she was the leader of a settlement expedition, taking command when circumstances demanded. Freydis's story blurs the lines between fact and legend, much like many Viking sagas, where truth and fiction were often entwined for dramatic effect. While these sagas and runestones glorify Viking women in heroic roles, it is essential to recognize the idealized nature of these depictions. Were women like Lagertha and Freydis exceptional in their bravery, or were these figures shaped by the patriarchal needs of their time? Could their stories be more myth than truth, constructed for the glory of a male-dominated society? The question remains, how much of what we know is a celebration of legendary gender roles crafted by male storytellers? One of the most striking and mysterious aspects of Viking women's roles lies in their connection to spirituality and magic. In Viking culture, women known as volvas, shamanic seers or prophetesses, played vital roles in both spiritual and practical matters. These women were often seen as mediators between the human world and the spiritual realm, invoking the power of gods and spirits to provide guidance in times of crisis, war, and even during the founding of settlements. The volvas were thought to have the ability to see into the future, summon spirits, and influence natural forces. The Poetic Edda, a cornerstone of Viking mythology, contains references to female figures who wielded immense spiritual power, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. Their role extended far beyond mere healers. They were oracles whose visions had profound consequences on the political and social structures of Viking society. Yet, how did the Vikings balance such power with their gendered expectations? In a world that valued strength and combat, were these women truly powerful, or did their spiritual roles provide them a temporary escape from the physical limitations imposed on them by society? Did the Vikings see volvas as equals, or were they still relegated to a separate sphere? What influence did these women really have in a society driven by warrior ideals? Viking marriage customs reflect a deeply pragmatic and strategic society. Women in Viking communities were often central to alliances, as marriages were used to secure political and economic power. Viking women had certain legal rights that were rare in other medieval societies, such as the right to divorce, own property, and even to initiate legal disputes. However, these rights were often limited to free women in certain regions of Viking society, particularly in Iceland, where women enjoyed a degree of autonomy that their counterparts elsewhere did not. Concubinage was another aspect of Viking marital life, with men often taking multiple concubines in addition to their primary wives. These concubines played an important role in securing alliances, ensuring the continuation of lineages and increasing wealth and influence. However, they did not share the same social status as the legitimate wives, and their children were often excluded from inheritance rights. These secondary marriages added layers of complexity to Viking social structures, where prestige and lineage were paramount. While women had some control over their marital arrangements, they were still subject to the vagaries of political and social dynamics. Women who refused marriages or who sought divorce were often doing so in the face of immense social stigma. In a world governed by the demands of alliances and bloodlines, the freedom Viking women had was not absolute, but geographically and socially contingent. How did women navigate the boundaries of marriage in Viking society, and what was their agency in the midst of an ever-evolving landscape of power and politics? The role of women in the settlement colonies of the Vikings, particularly in Iceland, the Shetlands, and Greenland, offers a glimpse into a world where women were key players in the establishment and maintenance of Viking society in the New World. In Iceland, for instance, Viking women were not just caregivers or homemakers. They were landowners, legal participants, and managers of estates. The Althing, the world's oldest functioning parliament, was founded by Viking men and women alike, who shared the responsibility of governance and lawmaking. In Greenland and the Shetlands, Viking women were often tasked with overseeing household affairs, managing trade, and ensuring the survival of communities in extremely harsh conditions. The women of these colonies not only maintained economic ties with Europe but often became the linchpins of Viking trade, mediating between the Inuit and the Viking settlers. This strategic role placed them at the forefront of Viking expansion, where their influence was just as critical to settlement success as their male counterparts' maritime ventures. But these colonies were not without their challenges. Women in Greenland faced unpredictable climates, and with the collapse of Viking settlements, the role of women in these communities shifted dramatically. What happened when these women, who had built and sustained Viking societies, found themselves in a world-changing situation? What influence did Viking women have in the collapse of Viking settlements, and what does their legacy in these lands reveal about the resilience of the female Viking spirit? As Viking settlements in the farthest corners of the world began to collapse, the legacy of Viking women remains largely hidden in the shadow of myth. Were they the true architects of Viking success? And when these colonies crumbled, did they go quietly, or did they fight to the bitter end to protect everything they had worked for? The question of what Viking women left behind, and how they truly lived, may be one of the most significant untold stories of the Viking Age. In the early 9th century, York, then under Anglo-Saxon rule, fell into the hands of Viking invaders, who would soon transform it into the bustling Viking settlement of Jorvik. In this bustling city, Viking settlers made use of the landscape's natural advantages, creating an urban hub on the banks of the River Ouse. With its strategic position for both land and sea trade, Jorvik became one of the most important Viking cities in Europe, not merely a city of warriors but of merchants, craftsmen, and politicians. Archaeological discoveries, including remains of Viking longhouses and workshops, reveal a city built by and for Norsemen who intermingled with the native Anglo-Saxons in ways that would forever alter their cultural landscape. While many Viking cities were military strongholds, Jorvik's transformation into a trade capital marks a significant departure from the image of the Vikings solely as marauding invaders. Archaeologists have uncovered objects like Islamic coins and Byzantine-style jewelry, indicating that the Viking merchants of Jorvik were not just conquerors but vital players in a global economy that spanned from the Arab world to the Byzantine Empire. These findings underscore the idea that the Viking cities were cultural crossroads, blending influences from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. This cultural syncretism is part of the reason why Viking cities like Jorvik continue to capture our imagination. They were hubs of adaptation and power that outlasted the Viking Age itself. But how did these cities truly function as hubs of power? The Viking rulers of these cities, such as Ivar the Boneless and his descendants, did not just raid. They governed. In Jorvik, they established a network of local rulers and traders that allowed them to maintain control over crucial trade routes while subtly integrating local cultures. This meant the Vikings were not just imposing a military rule but were establishing a legacy of governance, paving the way for the eventual Anglo-Saxon kings to rise from these cultural amalgamations. The Vikings in many ways were founders of cities, not merely destroyers. Across the Irish Sea, the city of Dublin became another key Viking settlement, founded by Norwegian Vikings in the early 9th century. In many ways, Dublin represents the Viking adaptability at its best, a city where Vikings blended seamlessly into the local Gaelic society. However, Dublin was not just a city of commerce. It was a kingdom unto itself, ruled by Viking kings who established dominance over the Irish people. It's often forgotten that the Kingdom of Dublin was one of the most influential Norse realms in Ireland for nearly 300 years. While raids were the means of Viking acquisition, settlement was their long-term goal. The Viking kings of Dublin, such as Sigtrygg Silkbeard, turned the city into an important center of trade. Goods like ivory from Africa, spices from the Far East, and silver from Arab lands passed through Dublin's thriving markets. As in Jorvik, the evidence of this multicultural exchange is clear in archaeological finds. Viking-style artifacts blended with native Irish craftsmanship, creating a unique cultural tapestry. But the Vikings did not simply conquer and settle, they transformed the very land they ruled. Christianity spread through Dublin under the Vikings' watch, with Norse kings converting to the faith, thereby facilitating cultural fusion. This integration of paganism with Christianity in Dublin speaks to the broader Viking experience, one of cultural fluidity and adaptability. Yet, as the Vikings assimilated into Irish society, did the Irish also change in ways the Vikings didn't expect? While Jorvik and Dublin were the political capitals of Viking rule, Hedeby, Koppang, and Ribe were the economic lifeblood of the Viking world. Hedeby, located on the Jutland Peninsula, was one of the earliest examples of Viking economic ambition, serving as a major trade port from the 8th century onward. It connected the Norse world with both Slavic and Frankish territories, allowing the Vikings to establish an early foothold in the European trade market. Hedeby's strategic position on the Baltic Sea allowed it to serve as a vital trade hub between the Scandinavian north and the European continent. Similarly, Koppang and Ribe were beacons of Viking commercial prowess, known for their extensive networks of trade that reached as far as the Byzantine Empire. Through these trading centers, the Vikings did not just send out raids but brought back wealth, foreign goods, and cultural ideas that would transform their society. Textiles, glassware, and silver coins found in these settlements speak to a highly sophisticated economy that moved far beyond mere plunder. It was this commerce, not just violence, that allowed the Vikings to rise to prominence. But with all this wealth came the power struggles inherent in Viking trade. Local lords often sought control over trade routes, while Viking merchants worked to maintain their autonomy, building trade alliances with local rulers. How did these alliances impact the Vikings' ability to hold onto their growing empire, and what role did marriage, political maneuvering, and commerce play in ensuring their success? This web of political and economic relationships would define the Viking Age, and it would be this interconnectedness that kept the Viking world at the heart of European commerce for centuries. In the next segment, we will explore how the Vikings shaped the cultural landscape of their settlements. How did Viking communities evolve in terms of language, law, and identity as they adapted to new lands? What cultural imprints did the Vikings leave on the very places they conquered and settled? And how did their legacies endure long after the Viking Age faded? The Viking diaspora is often portrayed as a tale of savage raiders, but the true legacy of the Vikings is much more complex and enduring. Their influence on urban foundations, cultural integration, and the building of European cities has left a lasting imprint that continues to shape modern societies. Far from being simple plunderers, the Vikings were builders, traders, and architects of urban change. The early Viking settlements in Ireland and Scotland are often viewed through the lens of violent invasion, but a deeper dive into the historical record reveals something more profound. The Vikings, particularly the Norwegian settlers in Ireland, integrated with and adapted to local customs in ways that would have far-reaching consequences for both cultures. Dublin, once a Viking stronghold, was later transformed into one of Europe's most cosmopolitan cities, a true hybrid of Norse and Gaelic culture. Though many Viking warriors were brutal in their conquests, Viking kings like Sigtrygg Silkbeard and Olaf Queren adopted local Gaelic traditions, learning to govern alongside and serve the interests of the native clans. This blending of cultures was so deep that, by the time Brian Boru defeated the Vikings at Clontarf in 1014, the Norse had become as much a part of Irish society as the native Gaels. In Scotland, the Norse presence didn't just bring destruction but also trade networks, new agricultural techniques, and a restructured society that influenced Scotland for centuries. The Orkney Islands, for instance, were so thoroughly integrated into Viking culture that their aristocracy ruled for over 300 years, creating a lineage that remained proudly Viking even as Christianity took hold. In the Hebrides, Scots and Norse shared a unique form of coexistence that was cemented through both trade and intermarriage, creating a lasting cultural synthesis that can still be seen in place names, laws, and customs. While raids were often violent, the Viking legacy in the British Isles was a long and complex process of integration that ultimately forged many of the region's distinctive cultures. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine them storming cities in raids, their longships cutting through the seas in search of treasure and glory. But behind the violence, there was a more enduring legacy, the creation of urban centers like Jorvik, York, Dublin, and Hedeby. These Viking cities were not mere military outposts but bustling hubs of commerce, governance, and culture. The Vikings' ability to establish enduring settlements in places as far-flung as the British Isles, Iceland, and even North America reveals a sophisticated understanding of city building, trade routes, and local governance. Jorvik, for example, was a Norse-led city that not only became the capital of the Danelaw but also became a major European trading center. The Vikings brought their engineering skills from advanced shipbuilding to the construction of marketplaces, and left an indelible mark on the city's architecture, governance, and economy. Even more telling, archaeological discoveries, from coins to textiles, reveal the thriving multiculturalism of Viking York. The Vikings traded extensively with the Frankish Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and even the Islamic world, introducing new craftsmanship, ideas, and luxury goods into Britain. Viking influence wasn't limited to trade. They also restructured local governance systems, bringing with them the Thing system of assembly-based decision-making, which would later influence medieval English law. Viking cities were therefore early urban centers, blending Norse and local practices in ways that paved the way for modern European urbanization. The cultural legacy of the Vikings is not only found in their cities but also in the language, law, and place names that have endured to this day. Viking influence on language can still be heard in place names, personal names, and even in the English language itself. Thousands of place names in England, from Grimsby to Derby, still bear the by suffix, meaning town or village, a legacy of the Vikings. This linguistic legacy has persisted for over 1,000 years, influencing the very sound of the modern English language. In law, the Vikings left behind more than just Vikings codes. They left a legacy that shaped European governance. The Viking Thing system, an early form of democratic assembly, eventually contributed to the development of English parliamentary systems. The idea of representation and justice by peers was far more democratic in Viking settlements than in many contemporary European monarchies. Through these ideas, the Vikings didn't just conquer, they transformed the systems they encountered. But the collapse of Viking settlements, particularly those in Greenland and Vinland, has been a historical puzzle. Why did the Vikings, who were so successful in integrating into existing societies, fail to maintain settlements in the New World and the North? Some historians point to climate change or economic collapse. But could the Viking settlers in Greenland have fallen victim to their own over-reliance on imported goods or hostile relations with indigenous populations? Perhaps the Vikings' inability to adapt to their surroundings, in a land so distant and unforgiving, was the fatal flaw that led to their downfall. This collapse presents a paradox. How could such intrepid travelers and city builders fail to secure their place in the world? As we continue this journey through the Viking Age, we will explore how these Viking settlements and integrated cultures left behind traces in the modern world, and how they continue to shape the global narrative of Viking history. What remains of Viking influence and how much of the story has been buried by time? While the Viking Age is often painted in the strokes of fearsome raiders, it was also a time of profound political and social reorganization. As Viking chieftains transformed into kings, the fragmented Scandinavian world gave rise to centralized monarchies. Harald Fairhair, often credited with uniting Norway, is just one example of how chieftainship gave way to monarchical authority. What's often underplayed is the significant role the Varangian Guard played in this shift. Far from just serving as the elite guard of Byzantine emperors, many Varangians brought back ideas of bureaucracy, legitimacy, and courtly governance, ideas that would influence the emerging Scandinavian kingdoms. But the real catalyst for the political centralization was the growing economic interdependence within Scandinavia. As Viking trade routes blossomed, Scandinavian elites needed to consolidate power over these wealth-producing lands. The growing power of the church furthered this centralization. Kings like Olaf II Haraldsson, Street Olaf, blended military might and religious legitimacy to consolidate power, and in doing so, effectively reshaped Viking society into a centralized kingdom ruled by divine right. The fall of the Viking raids was not a clean, singular event but a slow erosion of a way of life. While 1066 and the Battle of Stamford Bridge are iconic, the end of Viking raids is not merely a matter of losing battles. It's about the transformation of Viking priorities. In England, Alfred the Great's resistance marked a decisive shift in Viking tactics. The Vikings were no longer fighting for plunder. They were adapting to a world of more stable kingdoms, where wealth was less about raiding and more about managing land and trade. The real shift occurred when Viking kingdoms, like York, were more integrated into the medieval European economy than they ever were as raiding hubs. Simultaneously, Christianity's spread played a role in slowing raids. The religious unification of Scandinavia under monarchs like Harald Bluetooth created a new cultural framework for Viking society, one in which plundering no longer fit within the new Christian morality. In the 11th century, as Christian kings and nobles sought legitimacy, raiding gave way to diplomatic marriages, feudalism, and urbanization. The end of Norse paganism and the rise of Christianity wasn't just a religious shift. It was cultural genocide. The Viking gods, the mighty Odin, the thunderous Thor, the fertile Freya, were replaced by a single Christian god. The poetic Edda, which once glorified these gods, was soon overshadowed by Christian texts. However, what's often missed is how deeply pagan beliefs influenced early Christian rites and rituals. For instance, the Yule festival, which celebrated the birth of Thor, was merged with Christmas, and the old traditions lived on in a Christianized form. The forced Christianization didn't end with harsh conversions. In places like Iceland and Norway, Norse rituals still persisted covertly. Even with the Christianization of the kings, Norse gods remained part of everyday life, especially in remote rural areas. And while the temples were torn down and the idols smashed, the Viking spirit never fully left. The shift was complex. Christianity didn't simply erase the old beliefs, it absorbed them. Vikings had to redefine themselves from raiders to settlers within an integrated, Christianized Europe, blending the old with the new, forming the foundation of modern Scandinavian society. The Viking raids may have ended, but their legacy continues to ripple through modern Europe and the wider world. Their contributions to trade, governance, and the creation of cities like Jorvik, Dublin, and Normandy laid the foundation for modern Europe. However, the most enduring legacy of the Viking Age may not lie in their ability to raid but in how they shaped European identity, transforming from feared invaders to revered monarchs, from pagan warriors to Christian rulers. Yet the collapse of Viking settlements in places like Vinland and Greenland is a stark reminder of how adaptation can turn into collapse. These distant outposts, far from their homelands, faded away as climate change, internal strife, and lack of resources decimated their thriving communities. The Viking Age, while dramatically ending in 1066, marked only the beginning of a wider transformation, one where Vikings, having outgrown their raiding past, became integrated into the fabric of European civilization. The year 1066 marked a pivotal moment in history, a year that encapsulated the end of an era for the Vikings and the dawn of a new chapter in European history. The Norman conquest of England under William the Conqueror wasn't just a military victory, it was the culmination of centuries of Viking presence and influence. What most people forget, however, is that the Normans themselves were descendants of Vikings, their forebears having settled in Normandy in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Danish rulers of Normandy had integrated into the feudal system of the Franks, and from this blending of cultures, a new dynasty was born. But the legacy of the Vikings in the Norman conquest was not merely in their martial prowess. It was in their rule of law and their institutional innovations. William the Conqueror, a man shaped by his Viking ancestry, introduced changes to English society that would influence the development of medieval Europe. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1086, was an extraordinary exercise in the centralization of power, influenced by the administrative prowess Vikings had cultivated while establishing settlements across Europe. The Viking ability to balance military conquest with effective governance, combining local traditions with centralized rule, was not only integral to their reign but also vital in shaping the future of Europe's dynasties. In a strange twist, the Viking legacy lived on through the Normans, bridging a violent past to the creation of stable kingdoms. Far to the east, the Vikings' influence extended well beyond the shores of Western Europe. In the lands of the Byzantine Empire, the Varangian Guard, a group of elite Viking warriors, had a profound effect on both the empire's military prowess and its political intrigue. The Varangians, largely made up of Swedes and Norsemen, were seen as some of the fiercest fighters in the empire. Initially hired as mercenaries, they quickly earned a reputation for loyalty and ferocity, eventually becoming the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors. While many associate the Vikings with the brutal raids of Europe, their role in the Byzantine world was more complex and deeply interwoven with Eastern politics. The Varangians were not simply warriors. They were also diplomats, traders, and influential figures who played a key role in the Byzantine economy, facilitating trade routes that stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian. Some even rose to positions of great power, influencing the political landscape of Byzantium. The Varangian influence in the East is a fascinating chapter of Viking history, and it's largely overlooked. The intertwining of Viking and Byzantine culture left an indelible mark on the Eastern legacy, influencing religious practices, architecture, and military tactics that would resonate through the ages. The Vikings left their mark not only in the physical structures they built or the cultures they influenced but in the very genetic makeup of modern populations. When we think of Viking descendants, we often imagine the fierce, large, battle-hardened warriors from the Sagas. Yet, genetic studies have shown that the Viking impact on Europe was not just a matter of conquest. It was about intermarriage and integration. Genetic analysis of modern European populations has uncovered startling facts. Up to 10% of the population in certain regions of England, Ireland, and Scotland can trace their lineage back to Viking settlers. This impact is not limited to the British Isles. Areas like Iceland, Norway, and even parts of Russia show a notable presence of Viking DNA, especially among the male population. The Vikings were not just invaders, they were settlers. The idea of Viking raiders storming into villages, killing, and leaving is only part of the story. In many cases they stayed, intermarrying with local populations, leaving their genetic fingerprint on the European gene pool. But it's not only in the Celtic lands that Viking blood runs deep. Even today, the genetic legacy of the Varangians, those who ventured into Eastern Europe and Russia, continues to influence the populations of these regions, a legacy that is still being uncovered through modern DNA research. These findings are reshaping our understanding of the Viking Age, showing that the Viking impact on Europe was far more lasting and profound than we ever imagined. For centuries, the Vikings were seen as little more than the violent marauders of legend. Their legacy had been obscured by the medieval chroniclers who, often with the weight of Christian ideology behind them, cast the Vikings as barbarous heathens. But in the 19th century, something remarkable happened. The Vikings were rediscovered. It was during this time that historians, archaeologists, and writers began to take a fresh look at the Vikings, not just as raiders but as pioneers, traders, settlers, and cultural transmitters. The Viking revival coincided with the Romantic movement, which embraced the idea of a noble and rebellious past. The idea of the Viking as a symbol of freedom, individuality, and heroism resonated deeply in an era marked by growing national identities and political change. This rediscovery wasn't without its issues, though. As the Vikings were romanticized, their history was often distorted. The image of the Vikings as noble, rugged warriors fit into the romantic ideals of the time, but it obscured the true complexity of Viking life. The Vikings were not simply noble adventurers. They were multifaceted people engaged in trade, craftsmanship, politics, and warfare. The Vikings were not just free-spirited men on the fringes of Europe, they were deeply involved in the shaping of medieval society. Yet, the 19th century revival painted them as warriors of the wild, an idealized image that still persists today in our popular culture. The Viking Age's legacy has been framed in various ways through the ages, but the romanticization of the Vikings in the 19th century created a vision of the Norse that has stuck with us to this day. Movies, TV shows, and even novels continue to romanticize their image as berserkers in horned helmets, bloodthirsty and rebellious. Yet, the reality of Viking life was far more complex. For example, the Viking longship, often depicted as a simple weapon of war, was in fact a marvel of engineering designed for both commerce and warfare. The Vikings were traders, settlers, and merchants as much as they were warriors, and their raids were often motivated by economic factors rather than mindless brutality. What is more intriguing, however, is the way that Viking culture has been appropriated for nationalistic purposes. In countries like Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, the Viking past has often been portrayed as a symbol of national strength and pride, an idealized and unbroken link to a glorious past. But this idealization can be misleading, obscuring the more complex and less glamorous realities of Viking society. In many ways, the Vikings were more a product of their time than a singular force of nature. They were ambassadors of their age, integrating into and transforming the world they encountered, often in ways that were not as violent or heroic as the modern imagination tends to portray. As we look at the Vikings today, those mythic warriors of legend, it's important to remember that their legacy isn't just one of bloodshed and glory. The Vikings were also builders, traders, and leaders who helped shape the very world we live in today. But even as we continue to celebrate their incredible feats, we must ask, how much of what we know about the Vikings is fact, and how much is merely myth? The answer might surprise you, and it may change the way you think about the Vikings forever. The Viking Age, a period filled with untamed warriors, seafaring exploits, and kingdoms built through bloodshed, has come to symbolize the birth of a complex Norse identity. But beyond the romanticized image of berserkers and horned helmets, lies the true essence of Viking society, a civilization that, much like any other, grappled with its own internal struggles, beliefs, and contradictions. To unravel this, we turn to the Icelandic sagas, Eddas, and archaeological evidence, understanding that the stories we know today were often shaped by the hands of scribes and storytellers, centuries after the Viking Age had ended. The Icelandic sagas, preserved on parchment hundreds of years after Viking raids ended, offer us a window into a world of kings, warriors, and gods. Written in Old Norse, these sagas were a fusion of oral tradition and the Christian worldview of the scribes who wrote them. The historical accuracy of the sagas has long been debated. While they offer fantastic glimpses into Viking valor and the heroic ethos of Viking society, they were also influenced by Christian values that were taking root in Scandinavia by the 13th century. The sagas were written to create a shared identity for Norse peoples who were beginning to lose their connection to the heathen gods. Yet, these texts were not mere fictionalized accounts of the past. The stories of Ragnar Lothbrok and Ivar the Boneless are deeply rooted in the realities of Viking political struggles and military prowess. Ragnar, for instance, was not simply a mythic figure but likely a composite of several real Viking kings, a man whose raids shaped the geopolitical landscape of Northern Europe. As for Ivar, his name, known for his crippling disease, emphasizes the deep-rooted fear the Vikings had of fate and prophecy. But these sagas, as wondrous as they are, remain a reinterpretation of a bygone world. While the sagas focus on human endeavor, the poetic Edda and prose Edda offer us a deeper insight into Norse mythology. Through stories of Odin, Thor, and Loki, we gain access to the Viking worldview, an understanding of the gods as brave yet fallible beings, caught in an eternal struggle against chaos. These Eddas highlight the spiritual relationship between Norsemen and their gods, emphasizing the importance of honor and sacrifice in shaping one's destiny. However, unlike the sagas which focus on earthly glory, the Eddas delve into the cosmic battle of Ragnarok, where even the gods themselves would face destruction. Odin, the god of wisdom and war, would be slain by the great wolf Fenrir, symbolizing the ultimate inevitability of fate. The Vikings, it seems, believed their lives were intertwined with these mythic forces, giving their conquests a sense of urgency and divine purpose. Despite the grandeur of these epic tales, it is crucial to remember that these myths also reveal a stark truth about the Vikings. Their belief in fate's power meant that even the mightiest warriors would face inevitable destruction. The sagas and Eddas, then, not only served as an identity-forming tool for the Norse but as a means to grapple with the fragility of life itself. No exploration of Viking memory would be complete without the legendary heroes who live on in both history and myth. Figures like Ragnar Lothbrok, Bjorn Ironside, and Lager that have transcended time to become symbols of Viking masculinity and warrior culture. But these figures, often romanticized, represent a selective storytelling tradition that overlooks the socio-political complexities of Viking society. The figure of Lagertha, Ragnar's wife, often reduced to a mythical shield maiden, reflects a fascinating contradiction in Viking society. While some sagas depict her as an independent warrior, archaeological evidence suggests that women, while integral to Viking society, rarely fought alongside men in battle. However, what Lagertha's legacy teaches us is the flexibility of Viking culture, an understanding that women played active roles in politics, economics, and society. The Shield Maiden narrative, although largely mythical, does tap into the empowerment of Viking women in ways that historical sources often obscure. Similarly, Leif Erikson, often depicted as the first European to discover America, presents us with a mixture of truth and legend. While his voyages to North America, referred to as Vinland, are supported by archaeological findings in places like L'Anse aux Meadows in Canada, the full extent of his exploration is clouded by myth. His story, however, continues to serve as a catalyst for Viking exploration and expansion across the North Atlantic. Leif's journey serves as a symbol of the unyielding curiosity and ambition of Viking sailors, driven by the same myths and religious beliefs that propelled them to conquer far-flung lands. What the Sagas, the Eddas, and these legendary figures give us is not just a record of a people, but an enduring legacy, a connection to the Viking spirit that still resonates in our modern imaginations. The Vikings were not just raiders or plunderers, but cultural pioneers whose exploration, warfare, and cultural exchange shaped the course of European history. Through the lens of their mythic past, we can see their world in a new light, one where the line between myth and reality was often indistinguishable. And as we move forward, it's clear that their story is far from over. The Vikings may have faded from the historical stage, but their legacy remains alive, shaping everything from our modern understanding of heroism to language and place names across Europe. As we continue to look back at their memory, we are reminded that the Vikings were not simply figures of legend. They were real, they were complex, and they were, in their own way, the architects of the world we now inhabit. The Vikings, brutal raiders or sophisticated traders, travelers, and conquerors? Modern portrayals often veer into extremes, showing them as either bloodthirsty warriors or misunderstood romantics. While the horned helmet myth persists in pop culture, there's an even greater distortion that modern audiences often overlook: the Vikings' impact on the world's development. Beneath the rugged images of longships slicing through the fog is a story of complicated diplomacy, cross-cultural exchanges, and extensive urbanization that rivaled the more established cultures of the time. The Viking trade network alone is an underreported marvel. Far from being mere pirates, the Norsemen were skilled traders and diplomats. Consider the treasure troves of silver dirhams recovered from Viking graves. These silver coins, minted in the Islamic world, demonstrate that the Vikings' trade routes extended far beyond Europe. The Varangian Guard, composed largely of Vikings, played an instrumental role in the Byzantine Empire, influencing Eastern Mediterranean politics. These were not the exploits of reckless raiders, but of strategic allies and economic powerhouses, whose cultural influence reached well into the heart of the Eastern Roman world. Yet, when the Vikings are immortalized in popular culture, these sophisticated aspects are often overlooked in favor of mythologized violence. The Last Kingdom and Vikings may have filled the screens with blood, but they missed the nuances of Viking governance, diplomacy, and their role in shaping medieval society. Viking rulers like Rollo didn't simply terrorize Europe. They forged new dynasties, intermarrying with French royalty, and eventually became the Dukes of Normandy, an event which changed European history forever. But the greatest misrepresentation? The berserkers. The frenzy often attributed to these warriors isn't purely a physical mania but likely a ritualized state of focus, akin to the trance-like states used by shamans across different cultures. Viking berserkers weren't merely insane fighters. They were seen as spiritual warriors, infused with supernatural power. The mythical frenzy attributed to them was often a cultural construct used to bolster Viking mythology. In truth, these men were elite soldiers trained in the art of combat, not mere wild animals charging into battle. These distortions were not mere accidents. In the 19th century, the Viking image was deliberately romanticized during the Romantic period, with artists and historians presenting them as noble warriors fighting for freedom. The influence of Wagner's operas, specifically his Ring Cycle, cemented the iconic Viking in the public's imagination, a fearsome yet chivalric symbol of northern heroism. This artistic movement, which coincided with a surge in nationalism, painted the Vikings as paragons of noble savagery, a heroic backdrop for European national identities. But the reality is far more complex. The Vikings were polyglot travelers, often assimilating into the cultures they encountered. Dublin, once a Viking settlement, became a melting pot of Norse, Gaelic and even Anglo-Saxon influences, laying the foundation for one of Europe's greatest cities. The Viking presence in Britain too evolved. At first feared as ruthless invaders, they would eventually become integral to the fabric of English society, with Anglo-Norse rulers uniting kingdoms under their rule. And while modern interpretations of Viking culture are often colored by cinematic portrayals, the reenactment culture that flourishes today does offer a slightly more accurate picture. Through their immersion in Viking life, reenactors challenge the myths by engaging in historically informed living history, from crafting authentic Viking ships to hosting medieval markets and engaging in combat drills. This resurgence, far from glorifying the chaos of Viking raids, seeks to understand the diverse and multifaceted nature of Norse culture. But what, then, was the Viking Age? Was it a time of reckless warriors whose brutality shaped the course of Europe? Or was it a time of profound transformation, one that reshaped trade, cities, and cultures from the Mediterranean to the North Atlantic? The truth, somewhere between these two extremes, is perhaps more remarkable than any myth. As the Viking diaspora stretches across time and space, the modern fascination with the Vikings seems to be part of a larger, enduring story. Who we are and where we come from, and how, centuries later, we still strive to reclaim a piece of that untamed world. The Viking Age remains one of the most captivating and misunderstood periods of European history. On the surface, the Vikings are remembered for their raids, seafaring, and iconic imagery of warriors clad in armor. Yet beneath this facade lies a rich tapestry of cultural, economic, and social developments that shaped not only the medieval world but the foundations of the modern era. The Viking Age wasn't simply an era of bloodshed and plunder. It was a time of profound political transformation. Viking expansion into the British Isles, the Frankish territories, and the vast expanse of Eastern Europe created new political entities, such as the Danelaw, Normandy, and the Kievan Rus. The Vikings established settlements that integrated local populations, creating a multicultural environment where Norse culture blended with Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Slavic traditions. The Vikings' ability to adapt and integrate into these new societies was not only a matter of survival but also a testament to their astute diplomacy and organizational prowess. For instance, Viking rulers in England such as Knut the Great managed to unite not only the English but also parts of Denmark and Norway, creating a North Sea empire that influenced the political landscape of Europe for decades. In the Danelaw and Normandy, the Vikings left an indelible mark on the local governance and law systems. The Viking legal systems, though rooted in tribal traditions, influenced the development of early English common law. Viking thing assemblies, local councils, became the foundation for democratic participation, where free men could voice grievances and make decisions. This form of governance, based on consensus and representation, would later contribute to the evolution of parliaments in medieval Europe. As the Vikings expanded and encountered the Christian world, their pagan beliefs began to evolve, not just in a simple act of conversion, but through a process of cultural synthesis. Norse mythology, with its pantheon of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, gradually intertwined with Christian iconography and practices. The syncretic blending of these two belief systems, particularly in Viking-run territories like Iceland and Norway, shows how religion was as much about identity and political pragmatism as it was about faith. The Vikings didn't simply abandon their gods. They reinterpreted them within the context of their changing world. This blending of Christianity and Norse spirituality would become evident in the Icelandic sagas, where Christian themes were subtly woven into the epic tales of gods and heroes. The true legacy of the Viking Age is not solely defined by its raids and conquests, but by its transformative effects on the societies they touched. Their impact on trade, law, and urbanization continues to shape the modern world. For example, the city of Dublin, founded by the Vikings, remains one of Europe's most vibrant cities and a testament to their role as city builders. The Vikings were not just destructive forces. They were agents of change, blending their own culture with the lands they settled, helping to shape the course of medieval Europe. As we delve deeper into the Viking Age, it becomes clear that their influence was not confined to the battlefield. The Vikings were pioneers of exploration, setting the stage for the Age of Discovery centuries later. The Vinland Saga, chronicling the journeys of Leif Erikson, paints the Vikings as explorers who reached the New World centuries before Columbus. This understanding of the Vikings as explorers, rather than just plunderers, adds a layer of complexity to their legacy. It challenges us to think of the Vikings not only as a symbol of chaos but as a source of inspiration for a world still grappling with questions of identity, culture, and power. The Vikings remind us that transformation, whether cultural, political, or religious, is both inevitable and necessary for the survival of any society. In the 19th century, the Vikings were rediscovered not just as historical figures, but as symbols of a romanticized ideal. The Victorian-era fascination with Vikings, marked by the rise of Nordic nationalism and the revival of Viking sagas, helped shape the modern myth of the Vikings as noble warriors who represented freedom and resilience. However, this idealization overlooked the complexities of Viking society, reducing it to myth rather than history. The horned helmets, a product of 19th century artists, became entrenched in popular imagination, despite being an anachronistic invention. While these images capture the spirit of Viking culture, they also obscure the reality of Viking life, which was far more nuanced and multifaceted than the simplistic vision of savage warriors. The contemporary revival of Viking culture, through media, music, and reenactments, has created a new cultural identity for the modern world. Yet this revival often teeters on the line between authenticity and romanticism. The Viking ideal, however, continues to resonate deeply because it embodies a longing for authenticity in a world increasingly dominated by digital abstraction and superficiality. But in this search for truth, we must separate the myth from the reality and understand that the true Viking legacy lies not in the horns they wore, but in the bravery, adaptability, and vision that shaped their era. And so ends this journey through shattered shields, sacred songs, and the silent ruins left behind by those we now call Vikings. But their story doesn't really end here. Not in the sagas, not in the soil, and certainly not in us. If this series gave you something to think about, a new question, a lost name, a hidden truth, then let it live on. Share it. Rewatch it. Carry it forward. To those watching for the first time, thank you. I hope you found more than just history here. Subscribe if you haven't already. There's more to uncover, and the past still has things to teach us. And to our returning viewers, your hunger for truth is why stories like these survive. This was the Viking Age. We told it not because it was simple, but because it mattered,